welcome. You have joined Reconciliation, a 4-part webinar series on the mission and ministry of reconciliation. We're going to just take a few moments as our different participants join us. The panel with us this afternoon, is Father Frank, Bruce, myself, and Mary, and our presenters for today, our sister Suzanne Giblin and Peggy McGuire. Sister Suzanne is a member of the Sisters of St. Joseph's of Chalandet. Am I saying it correctly, Suzanne? I'm not.
Carondelet.
Thank you, Condelet.
Yes, thank you.
And then Peggy is an associate of the sisters, and they will be our presenters this afternoon. We have 7 attendees that have signed on. The session is being recorded, and without further ado, I'm going to share the screen, and I'm going to let Peggy and Suzanne take it over. Suzanne, Peggy.
All right. Thank you. Well, I think most of us would say that from our own experience of forgiving and being forgiven, we know that reconciliation is always a journey and sometimes a pretty long one. Jesus and 2 of his followers also had that experience as they walked their long journey from Jerusalem to Emmaus. So we're going to take a look at that story from Luke's Gospel. The long journey. 2 followers of Jesus were fleeing Jerusalem and going to Emmaus. On their journey, they shared their fear, hopelessness, and confusion about the death of Jesus. Jesus joined them on the long walk, listening, asking questions, and offering insights. When they reached their destination, Jesus acted as if he were going on. The travelers said, "Stay with us," and he did. They continued their conversation at table, and they recognized Jesus as they broke bread together. And then suddenly, Jesus vanished. What just happened? Where did he go? And then they remembered what he had said to them. And they knew something new and good had happened within them because this stranger had accompanied them. They ran to tell the others, who shared similar stories of new life. Let's take another look at this long journey and see what it might say to us about the experience of accompanying people on their journey. Going back again, 2 followers of Jesus were fleeing Jerusalem and going to Emmaus. I was really struck by that word, fleeing, because I think it's a powerful word and it names a powerful reality. I spent a lot of years as a pastoral associate in various parishes. And one of the things that I found was when I worked with people who were going through the annulment process, what happened for them, and I think it happens for many of us, When something is really painful, we just want to run away from it. We don't want to deal with those deeper issues. What happened in that annulment process, even though it was painful for them, was that it did give them an opportunity, because of the questions, to go back and to try to make some sense of that divorce. What had gone on in their courtship and in their marriage that led to the breakdown of that marriage. Sometimes, and they would say this themselves, by doing that, they got a deeper understanding and newer perspectives on what had happened in the marriage. And that sometimes allowed them to experience some healing, which also led them to forgiveness of themselves sometimes or their ex-spouse, and then maybe to reconciliation, not of the marriage, but at least of the relationship itself. Well, that same kind of thing happened to those two followers of Jesus on that journey. And it happened because they encountered a stranger who accompanied them on their journey. Jesus joined them on the walk. And here's what he did. He listened, he asked questions, and he offered insights. Now, that can seem like a pretty ordinary encounter among strangers. But this stranger, Jesus, does something different. He does not just walk with them, he really does accompany them. First thing he does is show his interest in them by asking them a question. What are you talking about as you walk along? And then he listens to them. He gives them the opportunity to tell their story, to speak about that event of Jesus' death and what it did to them, about their sense of loss and their sorrow, their disappointment, sometimes their anger, their loss of hope and of trust. On this long walk, which is like 7 miles, Luke tells us, on that long walk, they are able to tell and retell that story because Jesus listens to them without trying to fix them. He just creates an atmosphere of hospitality and caring. But as they journey along, he does something more. He shares his perspective and his faith that God is traveling with them on this journey. First, remember, he has listened to them with acceptance and love and compassion. But then he starts with Moses and the prophets and helps them to see that God has been part of the journey of God's people, and he'll continue to be with them on their journey. He gives meaning to their loss by telling the story of the Messiah from God's perspective. And this helps them to begin to make some sense of this death of Jesus and this strange news that came from the women who could not find Jesus' body in his tomb. What Jesus does is to invite them to put that tragedy into context, to see that their disappointment and to see that disappointments and tragedies have always been a part of the history of God's people, but that they can now look back and remember that God has always journeyed with his people and shown them God's mercy. I think that for Jesus and the journeyers, but also for us and for those with whom we journeyed, it's that storytelling, that healing of the memory, the journey to possible forgiveness and reconciliation. All of that begins with accompaniment. And we know from our own lives that Jesus often invites us to accompany others on their journeys. Um, Maybe it's because I'm getting older, but I know that so often today I hear from people who are really struggling with their loss of independence because their children have taken their car keys away from them. They can no longer drive, or because their children say, sorry, mom and dad, we can no longer take care of you. Your needs are greater than what we can do. And so you need to be in a nursing home facility. Maybe some of you have walked with those children who are making that difficult decision to, they don't want to hurt their parents, but they have to keep them safe. So they need to take the car keys. They need to make the arrangements for the nursing home. I think most of us have walked journeys with people who are experiencing a serious illness, maybe physical, maybe emotional, and probably almost any one of us can say that we have walked the journey, accompanied others when they are taking that journey of grief because they have lost a loved one. Those are just some few examples of personal um, experiences and hurt that people have had. But I also know that some of you have journeyed with people who have experienced alienation and hurt from cultural or political or church events. In all those cases, our listening, our compassion, our questions may help a person to begin to let go of the pain and to move toward acceptance, forgiveness, and reconciliation.
Back into the story. When they reached their destination, Jesus acted as if he were going on. And the travelers said, "Stay with us." And he did. What do you suppose the disciples sensed in Jesus that prompted them to invite him to stay on with them? Was it his openness? His ability to listen, to learn from them, to ask questions without being invasive, rude, or judgmental? Obviously, there was a quality of presence about Jesus that made them want to spend more time with him. And he did. How often do we as ministers find ourselves being impatient that the victim is telling his or her story again? The same story that we have heard, and they're telling it again. And we're distracted because we have heard these details repeatedly. We hope to heaven the person comes to a period and goes away. Note the contrast, the selflessness of Jesus, who was willing to give up his agenda, to change his plans, and to let the travelers set the agenda. Next slide down. They continued their conversation at the table and recognized Jesus as they broke bread together. Suddenly, Jesus vanished. As ministers, we value the importance of ritual, of word and sacrament as a means of encountering God. I think it's interesting that Scripture tells us that Jesus celebrated the ritual of baptism only once, and that at the request of his cousin John the Baptist. Scripture also tells us that Jesus broke bread with friends and strangers over and over. Could it be that telling and retelling one story is also a means of encountering God in everyday life? And that accompaniment is a means to that communion. It seems it may be. They recognized him. While accompaniment may set the stage, it is God who gives the grace to see differently. Next, what just happened? Where did he go? Then they remembered what he had said to them. Our experience as ministers tells us that often it is necessary for the accompanier to take leave in order for conversion to happen. This is not abandonment. It is simply offering a gift of privacy, which allows the person to encounter God in naked honesty and aloneness. It is in this solitary place that one discovers oneself, embraced by a God full of mercy and love. Our experience as ministers teaches us to exercise a quality of presence that includes a quality of absence. I've witnessed this often when ministering to the dying. The person who has been attending for hours, maybe days, is called out for a very brief time, and the loved one takes his or her last breath.
May we have the next slide, please? And they knew something new and good had happened within them because this stranger had accompanied them. Not only for Jesus and the journeyers, but also for us and for those with whom we've journeyed. After the encounter, it is that storytelling, the healing of the memory, the journey to possible forgiveness and reconciliation that all begin with accompaniment. Next slide. They ran to tell the others. With hearts burning within them, they returned to Jerusalem to share the good news of what they had experienced with the others. Next slide. And the others shared similar stories of new life, and that sharing those stories of Jesus, of new life, and that ministry of reconciliation continues down to this day with us.
Next slide. So let's take a look at the elements of that journey that's so beautifully depicted in that long walk. The victim tells the story. Telling and retelling, perhaps. And the story may lead to healing. May lead to healing. There is so much of God in this, isn't there? The openness, the grace of openness to change, to listen, to be healed. And that healing that allows a change of heart, to see with a new perspective. To forgive, not forget. And with God's grace, to reconcile or become one with oneself, what is the deepest and truest in oneself, with the other, and finding all oneness in God. Accompaniment is the human instrument, the sacrament, if you will, that makes God's mercy and love present and operative. It is all God's work. The storytelling, the healing, the forgiveness and reconciliation available to us who are open and ready to begin this long and difficult journey. And what a privilege it is to be asked to accompany or companion anyone on that journey of grace. Let's take a look at the victim. The victim needs to tell and retell the story. Do you have someone or a situation in mind? They need to be listened to and really heard. Pay attention. To experience what they are saying will be held in trust, held in confidence, and not turned around and flung back at them. To make sense of and give meaning to the event. We know so often that a victim, once in touch with that reconciliation and the forgiveness, is able to make that a bridge, their experience of hurt, a bridge to someone else who has experienced a similar event. That's the way they make sense of, that they are able to forgive without ever forgetting. And to begin to see the event from God's eyes, as God is using even that as a way of bringing the reign of God, the reign of communion and love and mercy. That horrendous event has now been turned into an event of grace. Next slide. Let's look at what the accompanier needs. To listen without judgment. I was part of an exercise group that's a no judgment zone. I love that. And what a gift it would be if I could give that gift to everyone who comes into my presence, to listen non-judgmentally, to listen with patience as they tell the story over and over, to hold the story as a sacred confidence, a piece of this person's very life and heart. To ask questions that invite the victim to go deeper into the story, naming and exploring the feelings. Can you say some more about that? Or making observations that are compassionate as you experience and check out what the person may be feeling. Always keeping the focus on the victim, not the one, the perpetrator. What is happening to the victim? For it is only there that the person has power to do anything. I am able to manage within myself and take responsibility for myself, but not change the perpetrator.
In reconciliation, the experience of accompaniment is transformative for both the victim and the accompanier. Again, I think if we look to our own experience, maybe of someone who accompanied us on our journey, or a person with whom we took the journey, I think we can probably always say that in every one of those experiences, somehow we have been changed by that experience of accompanying the other. So let's just go back now and sum up. What might that Emmaus story tell us about reconciliation? Well, first of all, and for me this is good news, accompaniment, forgiveness, and reconciliation are all God's work. I don't have to fix it. I don't have to have all the answers. This is God's work. Reconciliation is always a journey. In some cases, you know, a pretty fast one, but I think for most cases it takes some time, and that's why it is a journey. Accompaniment is a process by which God's presence is realized on the journey toward reconciliation. And this is beautiful. God's Spirit empowers both the reconciler and the reconciled to continue the ministry of reconciliation.
Wow. Suzanne, Mary, thank you for that really engaging presentation. I'm going to stop sharing the slide screen right now and open it up first to the other members of the planning team to see if anything was stirred in you that you might want to share at this moment. Mary, you're the first person that I see on the screen. Mary, is there anything that you would like to comment on or emphasize or underscore?
Well, I certainly echo that it was a very beautiful presentation. What I found myself doing, I really entered into the process as much as that's possible, but I could feel myself that I was on the journey and experiencing the elements of reconciliation, of healing, of sometimes being the provocateur in that kind of a situation, in the sense that we lead the conversation. But I felt it very much as an experience. And I think that's very powerful because it means it went very deep, and now I have to unpack it.
Great. Thank you very much, Mary. Father Frank, anything that you'd like to share?
A couple of things struck me. One is I think our first tendency is to want to fix things, to go in and manipulate and change and manage, and you should do this, you should do that. And I think it's a sharing in the Paschal mystery to hold back from doing that, to kind of give up that part of us and trust the process and trust the grace that goes through. So the presenters were terrific in terms of saying that the journey and the process is itself part of the healing and also God's work. The other thing that struck me is we can apply what's said so easily, even though it's complicated, so easily in one-on-one pastoral situations. How much more difficult it is when we're dealing with complex social situations, like a parish that has experienced scandal or shock or difficulty around one thing or another, and how much longer a journey might be for that. Even the merging or coupling or whatever they do with parishes, and the kinds of feelings that kicks up in them in terms of loss. And then I think of our own political conversation here in the United States, our own political lack of conversation, if you will, and how the 24-hour news cycle almost prevents any kind of journey and any kind of time taking to see what kinds of understandings, what could we let go of, what can we begin to accept, et cetera. And so therefore, how the church has to kind of model what reconciliation and accompaniment might look like in a society where this seems almost impossible, and to throw another thing seems a lot more appropriate rather than try to find reconciliation. So those are two very helpful thoughts. Thank you so much. Good.
Thanks, Frank. Bruce?
I think that one thing that I would point out and remind everybody is that as this process of engaging and accompanying and building relationships with people creates an environment where when reconciliation is necessary, we have to remember that we are changed. We never go back to where we were. We end up on a new path. And it's in this interaction between both parties that we find God's grace and how he changes us to move us down into a new path, a way of discovering ourselves and the person that we were engaging with.
Great. Yeah. Good. Thank you very much. A couple of thoughts that I had as Suzanne and Peggy, as you were talking, a little bit of a confession here. I need reconciliation, I guess. I just finished Schreider's book, and there's a piece in here. He says the ministry of reconciliation begins with a careful but intense accompanying of victims. That's all of what Peggy and Suzanne talked about. And then he goes on to emphasize what they emphasized. It's marked by listening patience that allows the victim to reveal that which is a burden, even when the victim cannot articulate it themselves. So I just think that was really, really important, because just as Frank was saying, I mean, I just, I get impatient. I want to fix it. I want it to be done. I want to bring closure to it. And there is a telling and a retelling of the story. Suzanne and Peggy, you emphasized that those who accompany have to be able to hold that. And the image that came to mind is we need to be really centered and balanced and grounded, because if we're not, the slippery slopes, if you will, or just the tension of all of the pain or the violence that this person has gone through, it will be hard to hold them. So we need to be solid when we do that. The other thing is the question of forgetting. And I really liked what Schreider said about that. We never forget. We never forget. Rather, we remember in a new way. And I thought that was a really powerful thing as well. I think at this point, Susan and Peggy, anything that you would like to add based on the comments that you've heard?
When Frank spoke about the moving beyond the one-on-one to a larger group, and gave the example of the parish, I was reminded about our own process of contemplative dialogue, which we're using in our congregation, and many are businesses and religious communities throughout the world are using that. It's slowing us down. It is, however, in the end, it is more satisfying and productive. And with a parish where there's so much energy and often a lot of negative energy coming up, the patience that it takes, the discipline to listen so that everyone, the minority voices as well as the majority voices, get heard, do not get lost. They may not be in agreement, but how important it is to listen in such a way that they know that they have been heard. As Frank said, it's a much larger production process, but the pieces are the same. That's
great. Thank you very much. Sister Mary Shaw wrote in the chat that whenever she heard the word accompaniment, she wrote down nourishment, creating a creative space, standing in solidarity with unconditional positive regard, thus freeing one to name their pain, hurt, anger, hurts, to one who cares, transformative, amazing how the one so hurt invites in the end, stay with me. I cannot believe you care, you're listening to me. Grace indeed. So wonderful, sisters, and encountering presence recreates. Thank you, sisters. The oneness, very word, accompaniment from companion, with bread, with presence, with opening ears, frees me or the one hurt. All I can say, excellent. So a lot to resonate there. From Mary's perspective. I'm not seeing any questions. We have one from Rock. It says, it seems that this process would support the sacrament well. People stay away from the sacrament for the most part. What could make this process attractive to more? So this is the question of the question of the sacrament that Rock raises. Any thoughts first from you, Suzanne, and you, Peggy, as our presenters?
Is Rock thinking of the sacrament of reconciliation?
Yes, I think he is.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you know, I think that the sacrament, we need to look, church, we church need to look at, or would benefit from looking at the sacrament of reconciliation and how its whole history, how it started. It wasn't, I go to confession every day or even once a week, or as we did in community, there was a regular confession day. That was not the thinking, the heart of the early church. And the development of the sacrament was that it ruptured, a person did something that ruptured relationships in community. And then the punishment, if you will, was given accordingly. Over 2 or 3 years, it might have been that they were excommunicated. They had put themselves outside the community. I think we would do well as a church to recall the roots of that sacrament, and that in the body it is an action of healing the body. It's a much bigger than God and me. It's the community and me. So that isn't a direct answer, but when reconciliation, the sacrament of reconciliation comes up and people say to me, oh, I feel so guilty. I haven't been to confession for blah, blah, blah. And I say, it's an opportunity to listen to their story and what is it that they feel guilty about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really, really very good. I couple of thoughts from my perspective, and I'm glad the way you responded, Suzanne, because there is a relationship between personal reconciliation and social reconciliation that Frank was talking about earlier. Matter of fact, when you asked the question, are you talking about, the social dimension, or are you talking about the personal, sacrament of reconciliation? Rock wrote back and said, both. I'm talking about both. And see, clearly they're connected. On the personal reconciliation, I think it would be just pastorally effective to see it as a continuum. And in terms of a continuum, I mean, you can think of the sacrament of reconciliation as kind of a cleansing. And so that can be a pretty quick and easy process. But it can also be a real deep examination of conscience. I'm remembering that image from the movie Amadeus, where Salieri is giving a confession. It's like his whole life. And I mean, it's a very, very long confession, right? So, I mean, that's part of that whole question of the journey. That's the part of the accompaniment. Would our confessors be willing to listen to us for an hour or an hour and a half as we really unburdened ourselves? And I think I think our confessors would be willing to walk with us in that way if they were prepared for that. Obviously in the parish setting, you're not going to be prepared for that. And frankly, as those who are doing the confessing, as the confessee, if you will, am I prepared for it? So I think there's a catechetical dimension here, so that we would go into the sacrament saying, this is what I'm looking for. So this is a longer conversation as opposed to the weekend kind of reconciliation. But that does bring us then to the social dimension, because as those who have confessed, we need to really claim then that power of God that has reconciled us, that forgiveness that has happened. Mary, do you want to chime in here? Is there something you wanted to say?
Well, I'm struggling a bit with this because of the question of the sacrament of reconciliation. I'm not against that, but it's just that, I do think, the kind of the journey, the listening. I know I can think of times when I haven't done that well. I think of other times when there really has been an effort and something happens to me and to the other person. And yet in the sacramental setting, which I believe in, but I struggle with that. And a lot of it has, past history and all the things like that. Because one can't do that. But maybe there is a way. When you were speaking, Don, I kind of said, well, maybe there is a way that you could begin the process of the confessor could begin the process in a dialogue with the person, who can begin to recognize whether they're the person that needs to find forgiveness or the person that needs to listen. And maybe it's never totally one or the other. It's probably a combination of the two. And maybe there is something that could be done. But I see it as a long process, or at least something that we would have to focus our attention to. I think the idea of accompanying somebody, many of us have had that as women, we've had that, but that we separate that from the idea of sacramental confession. I don't mean totally, if we've sinned, of course we confess that, but that isn't the place where the reconciliation can always happen. Reconciliation with God happens, but the reconciliation with the person's, we don't want to hear with them anymore, but we haven't asked for healing with the person perhaps that we have offended or who has offended us.
Right. That's very a good point, because our traditional understanding of the sacrament of reconciliation is a one-on-one, where I, as the confessee, am really I'm the perpetrator. I'm the one that has done, I'm the wrongdoer. Mm-hmm. And what would it be like? And Frank, I'm going to throw this to you. But what would it be like if someone would come into confession to you and say, I'm not here to confess my sins. I'm here to confess the suffering that I've experienced. And I can imagine, especially in the time of abuse, that might really be the case. That I'm not coming as a penitent. I'm coming as a victim. What's your thoughts on that, Frank?
Oh, there are so many thoughts there. Rock has asked such a great question. I want to say some other things before I get to that one, Don. I think, obviously, Sister was right when she said that the nature of what we recognize as sin and exclusion in the early church is very different than the way we treat it at this point, because we've so multiplied and so extrapolated and, in a sense, so scrupulized our sense of sin. And this gives us the idea that, confession is always a final event. I did this thing, I broke the law, I go to confession, I get my penance, and it's over and done with, which, of course, is 99% illusion. And it's illusion because every sacrament is only one moment in a much longer pastoral sacramental process. So what's happening at that moment, and I try when I'm trying to help priests or seminarians get an idea, what am I doing in the confessional? I am there to be a sign of God's unconditional mercy, so that through the sacramental rite, people will be able to appropriate that mercy which has already been given into their lives at that moment as that's needed and as that becomes part of a longer range process. So I made a distinction, it's not yet in the catechism, but it will be at some point, that not all sin is the same sin, because there's sin that people do and they do it willy-nilly and I couldn't care less and this is what I want. And then there's the kind of sin that maybe somebody like Luther or Augustine talked about. I really intend to direct my life this way, and yet these failings continue. And I think those are very different things, because one is a sin that takes place without a reference to a divine narrative, and the other is a sin that takes place within the reference of divine healing over time. And so kind of the deception of parts of the sacrament is that this is over and done with and we're finished, now go in peace, whereas there's always a lot of work to do both before and after. I think if someone came in to any priest and said, I need to express this, I hope it's not when they're in the confessional box, because that's set up to be come in, do it, and go, and who's waiting outside, and there's really no time to explore that. I hope that person would be invited to a different setting other than the sacrament of reconciliation, so that their story can be, in a way, disposed, so that at some point it may be part of a formal sacrament of reconciliation and part of a healing process. But I think any priest who would not listen or want to listen to somebody who is hurting that way is certainly betraying what ordination meant. You have to give, and you want to give these people that time.
Right.
And it's a grace in our own life when we do.
Right. Good. Mary Shaw weighed in here. She said it may help us to be cognizant of the 12 steps, kind of the question of the attic and that whole process. And I think that's another way of thinking about the process that's involved in reconciliation. It's just a very intriguing, and I would be very reluctant to speak on behalf of Rock. I think, just from a liturgical perspective, the question is what can we do liturgically and catechetically that would help these moments be really an encounter of the merciful Lord. And so I really liked what you were saying, Frank, that I would hope that a confessor, if someone came in and said, I've been victimized, this has happened to me, whether it's been physically abused by their spouse, whether it's been some form of violence that has happened to them, that they would be that the confessor would certainly pour out understanding and compassion and empathy, and invite them to join their sufferings with the Lord's, and to have that, and to offer accompaniment, that their sins, any sin that might have happened as they were dealing with that violence, is clearly forgiven, and that as they want to process it more, that the church is there for that to happen. I think, it's interesting, the idea of penance as referral. You might want to think about talking to this kind of a person.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very interesting ideas. And then I think, I know we did this with campus ministry. We would work with different ideas about examination of conscience, and then we would create reconciliation services so that people would come together in a community,
Mm-hmm.
and the community as a whole would begin to reflect on the kind of reconciliation they need, whether as wrongdoer or as victim. And I think that would be an interesting development.
Certainly the communal thing really helps put the whole sacrament into a better context.
Right. and can make it very reflective and prayerful. Bruce, you were going to weigh in?
Answering this question is sort of like when my wife asked me, does this dress make me look good? No matter what I say, I'm going to be in trouble, I'm afraid. I have to come at this from my point of view as a convert into Catholicism. In growing up, there was no concept in our Lutheran church of a reconciliation service or whatever. So as I got into the Catholic Church and asked my wife, well, what is all this stuff you do? Her answer was, well, it's what we do. We just go ahead and do these things. So as I started into the idea of the sacrament of reconciliation, it was sort of a mechanical process. You went in, you said what you had to, you came out, and okay, you're forgiven. And it always seemed empty for me. And as I thought more about it and grew into the church more, I started to recognize the idea that there is a process of going through forgiveness and reconciliation. The church has the sacrament, which is a formal way of addressing it within the church, but we also do the same type of thing among ourselves. And as I started to see what was, think about the process of what was going on, it started making more and more sense as to what it is we're trying to do. Whether you go into the sacrament or if you're working with somebody else, as we're bringing out in these presentations, there is a process of going through and reconciling. And the more we understand about it, the more we can appreciate how we're caring for each other and we're forgiving each other, but also we're involving God's love in that process. And it's in that holding of his hands, if you will, of us all together in that process is how we can make progress in the world and promote the idea of what God's love is and hopefully solve a few more problems along the way.
Right. Good. I'm noticing our time. There's no more questions in the question box or comments. Mary said goodbye. She's running off to another meeting, Mary Shaw. So I think what I'd like to do is bring us to closure. I want to give Susan and Peggy, I want to give you the last word. Certainly your presentation has stimulated, I believe, very rich and very deep considerations. And I'm very grateful to the two of you for this conversation. I do want to remind everybody that we would welcome donations to continue the work of reconciliation that USCMA is trying to do to help all of us in mission understand that reconciliation is one way of doing mission. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Suzanne and Peggy for final comments. Final comments, Suzanne and Peggy.
Something that I don't think we emphasize very much, but that I think is just critical is that whole notion of confidentiality. I can't think of anything worse than breaking confidence with someone with whom you are journeying. It would just be an experience of another tragedy and hurt, that we need some more reconciliation. So I would just want to underscore that, the importance of the confidentiality in that journey. And then the only thing I would say about, to add to the discussion about sacramental is, first of all, I think sacrament does happen in that journey, whether a priest is with us or not on it. But I do think there's something very important about ritual. And so maybe even as we look at the sacrament of reconciliation and communal settings, et cetera, how we might find new ways to ritualize this whole journey.
Good.
I have nothing to add except my gratitude to the questions that came, to the opportunity that Peggy and I have had to accompany each other in putting this together, and our good team from the office. So thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.
Well, with that, again, thank you very much, Suzanne and Peggy, for a very stimulating session this afternoon. Our last session is next week when Bruce and I try to tackle some of the practical aspects of the ministry and mission of reconciliation. Until then, Thank you again. God bless.
Thank you.
You.